The first picture that is in the book of my mother and grandmother, you can tell what they're thinking. It tells it all. In World War I, they said goodbye to my grandmother's son, my Uncle Floyd, and my mother when her husband, my father, went. And they gave me just a couple of weeks to pack up. They sent me out to Colorado. I finished photography school, and then they put me into aerial photography for analyzing aerial photographs. It was fascinating, I thought. So we were just in their hands. Whatever they wanted you to do, that's what you did. I really got a little apprehensive when my ship headed out into the North Atlantic. We didn't know it at the time, but we knew there were submarines, but they were operating in what they called wolf packs, and they would stalk convoys. We were very lucky. We went up far north in the Atlantic, and we couldn't go into the English Channel because there were German planes operating out of France. So we had to go up over Ireland. I was in Europe and England for 2 years. It was a beautiful, beautiful location. In fact, we had a Roman road run through our camp, and there was a little village walking distance nearby called Dorchester, and it had all the things that you see in the movies of English pubs, dart games, and all of that, and some real English characters. And there was plenty of wonderful, beautiful things to see in England. And I got a bicycle, and I roamed the roads of Oxfordshire when I had a time to do that. And there were no cars on the road. The only thing might be fuel trucks. Aside from that, you didn't have to worry about traffic. But there was a little airfield there that the Royal Air Force had, and they had turned it over to the Photo Reconnaissance. Headquarters somewhere would say, get pictures of such and such a place. They would send out our pilots. He would go out all by himself, couldn't use the radio. In those days, the pilots had to fly low. If they got lost, we never knew what happened. With cloud cover and all kinds of error that's possible, he could have been miles and miles from that. There was no GPS. You had to look out the window and see the streams, the cities, and that was the only way. In the meantime, you had to keep looking over your shoulder. They had quite an exhausting job. One of the first things was to find out where the pictures had been taken. Europe is a big place. Pilot would come in and he'd start looking at them, and then I would locate them on the map. He would know whether he had achieved his target or not. So the headquarters wanted to get more information. They could go after those particular photographs. We were not too far from places like Oxford, which I enjoyed. And Stratford-on-Avon, I was able to get there. I'd have to hitchhike. I remember Macbeth and the Merchant of Venice, and they were wonderful presentations, I thought. I got down to London quite frequently. In fact, one of the pictures here is the air raid sirens had just started, and everybody started disappearing down into the underground. I waited that long and got a picture of it. I took, they had a technical school in Oxford, and I signed up for a class. The man who taught the class his name was Walter Ferguson Bust. Then he invited me to his house, and he had 3 marriageable daughters, and they were very nice. As the war went on, and we went to France to be closer to the front lines. Before D-Day, of course, there were photographs up and down the French coast to see what was there, whether there were, significant obstacles, what the ground looked like, all of that. This is some aerial photographs of our airstrip, which belonged to the German Luftwaffe. They had a fighter squadron there. The Americans bombed the daylights out of the thing, and then just before they pulled out, just before we moved in, they dynamited or blew up the runway. We really had a rough landing there, but it wasn't a very pleasant place. All the buildings were destroyed. The French civilians were running around the place. There was munitions out on the field that were very dangerous. So we had to set up an operation there, and we had to protect it. We had to carry on with a laboratory to develop the photographs, and they took over a chateau in a town nearby, and in the basement, this is where the laboratories were. And so it's really amazing to move into a desolate, bombed out place like that and get a squadron operating. I was very fortunate to meet with a man who was a school teacher. He taught English, and so he undertook to teach me French, and I had many, many lessons with him. Somehow these friends you make under these kinds of circumstances are long-lasting, and you remember so much about it. One of the big problems was to supply the troops. So there was what they called the Red Ball Highway, and it goes from wherever you are up to the front lines. They had also connections that required courier runs all over. They wanted me to go with them because I could speak enough French. The French forces of the interior had camps here and there, and they would stop and challenge you. The Germans had taken down all the signs. The place was wild. My favorite picture in this book is this one here. German Panzer got knocked out. It's just sort of symbolic in a way. I got a furlough and I went to Scotland, and I stayed at an inn in a little town called Cranlarrick, which was at a crossroads of a couple glens. And Mount Ben More it's one of the highest mountains in the southern highlands. And so I checked out at the inn where I stayed, and they told me that it was climbable, but you had to be careful. And there were a lot of mountain goats on the mountain. So they gave me general directions, and I took off at 6 in the morning with fog so thick I had a hard time finding the mountain. But once you climb a mountain, you can't get lost, because just be sure you're going up. And I can remember grabbing grass to pull myself up and trying to avoid those sheep up there on the mountain. And I made it to the top. This picture here, when Philip and I went there, this has been 4 years ago, I was 89, I thought I'd try it again. And I got halfway up, and I have proof. When the war was over, I got my leave to Paris. I was young, and I didn't have what they call points. You had to have so many points to ship home. And the war was over, I'm back in England, and if you're married, you got points. You have kids, you get even more. So all I had was my service in France and the campaigns. So they turned me loose. I had rail pass to go any place. I went to Ireland, both Northern and Southern Ireland. And yeah, there was no film available in England. And so I had brought a roll of 35 millimeter. I think it was at least 25 foot. And I had it all wrapped up, and I had cassettes that were, you could open them, load them, develop the film. So that's how I had the film for all of these pictures. The Scottish universities had a program for Americans who were stranded, like myself. I was able to go to the University of Aberdeen, and there were guys from all over. University, I think, was started in the 15th century. Finally, I came home. I came home on a what had been a German luxury liner. The U.S. Navy took it over, and they renamed it the Liberté, and I think they gave it to the French. Came back into the harbor at about the same place we left. Guys looking out at the New York skyline as we came in, the Statue of Liberty. Our unit, the 27th Photo Recon, we had an artist, we had a stockbroker, we had a guy that worked in the steel mills up in Gary, just a mixture. And we all got along and learned a lot from each other. We got a presidential citation, and we got a French Croix de Guerre. And we had 400 roughly people, but we had 10 casualties. Right at within walking distance was this beautiful abbey of St. Peter and St. Paul, which had begun construction in the 12th century. And they have a cloister garden, and they have a monument to our group. Both in England and France, they were grateful to Americans. And I don't know any way to learn about a foreign country rather than associating with those people. In fact, when Janet and I went to Paris, this is 3 years ago, we stayed at a hotel just by coincidence, it was the 70th anniversary of D-Day, and they found out that I had been in France during the war, and they sent me a big bouquet and a bag full of food, and they expressed their thanks for the Americans, and I remember the phrase. It said, "We will remember forever."